next part is learning more about whom some of you may consider as the enemy, or editors and journals. In part two, I hope to provide you with a better understanding of the reasons why certain papers are published and others are rejected, by understanding more about editors and how journals function. And the last part of my series will be on the actual publication process itself. By understanding what happens when your paper is submitted and how the peer review process works, you will be better prepared and informed for future potential situations. Together, I hope that this package as a whole will provide you with the necessary knowledge and know-how to not only prepare your papers, but also to think more strategically about how to publish, where to publish, and even when to publish your work. With such a roadmap, I hope that you will be able to publish your work more efficiently. So with that, let's move to the topic of today's seminar and the agenda for today. I have divided my talk essentially into the what, the why, and also how to tell your story in a scientific paper by looking first at its basic structure, then by going through an example of a paper with good storytelling. Lastly, I will also be giving advice on how to think about your paper and potential ways to construct your story in the most effective manner. So with that, let's begin by discussing what is storytelling in a scientific paper. If I were to draw an analogy of storytelling, it would be probably quite similar to the process of diamond processing, as the fundamental properties of a diamond, which cannot be changed or modified, will inherently determine its value in its raw state. Yet, with the proper processing, such as cutting and polishing, its value increases and it becomes the object known as the diamond. If we look at scientific papers and storytelling, it is fundamentally quite similar, as the potential of a paper is dependent on the data set you have. However, by telling your story well, this can further enhance how a reader or an editor understands your work, thereby adding further depth to your work and also how it impacts society. Nonetheless, storytelling is not magic. So keep in mind that it will be dependent on your actual data set. If we were to visualize what storytelling actually looks like, it might look like something like this, whereby you start with pre-existing data or knowledge that has been previously established by others. And based on this data or knowledge, you form your question, which leads you to generating your hypothesis, which allows for hypothesis-driven testable experiments, which leads to the production of new data. Raw data without interpretation does not have much meaning on its own. Therefore, you need to interpret your data. And then this gives rise to knowledge and facts that are generated based on these interpretations. Then, from this knowledge, if a reader develops further insights into deeper processes, then one can say they have achieved a newfound understanding. A good story incorporates all these elements. So make no mistake that it is your job to explain the deeper insights obtained from your data, and it is not the job of the reader or editor to extract this. So, I assume some of you may be asking, why is storytelling important? Let me give you the main reason why. which has to do with the editorial process. First and foremost, after you submit your paper, you need to remember that it is going to be read by a busy person. Therefore, as an author, the first person you need to convince that your story is interesting to is the editor. An editor is typically very busy and has lots of papers they are handling simultaneously that are at different stages of the publication process. From my own experiences as an editor at Developmental Cell, typically editors handle something between 20 to 30 papers simultaneously. So you can imagine that together with other duties that an editor might have, there is only a limited amount of time one editor can spend on one paper per day. In fact, you should not expect an editor to have more than 20 to 30 minutes to read your manuscript. Therefore, make sure to tell your story effectively in a paper in the most exciting and understandable way possible, so that you can convince your handling editor that your work is interesting. Now, what if I told you that this is only actually half of the story? In fact, what if I tell you that this is typically a two-step process when a paper is submitted? This additional step occurs between an editor receiving your paper and making a decision on your paper. The handling editor typically reads your paper, does background research, and once they understand your paper, then they need to process this information and tell your story to the rest of their team. By doing so, it becomes a voting process on how suitable the paper is for the journal. Therefore, you need to tell your story effectively to the handling editor in order for them to also be able to tell your story in the most interesting way possible to their team. Furthermore, as editorial meetings are typically held daily and are on a very tight schedule, each paper is discussed typically no more than 5 to 10 minutes. So you can now appreciate that it is important to tell your story and its central message clearly to your handling editor, so that not only they find your paper interesting and become convinced, but also so that they can convince their team in such a limited amount of time. So don't forget that your storytelling impacts whether your handling editor can convince their team that your paper is interesting. I hope that this has now convinced you that the actual importance of storytelling. Now that you understand better why storytelling is important, let's move on to the next topic on our agenda. Next, in order to understand how to actually tell a story effectively, first, it is necessary to understand the basic overall structure of a scientific paper. Firstly, if we look at each section of a paper, the beginning corresponds to the introduction, the middle to the methods and results, and the end to the discussion and conclusions. If we then look at the structure of the paper, it looks something like this. As one can see, this shape is similar to that of an hourglass, and each part of that hourglass serves a specific function in a scientific paper, starting by providing background information of a general nature about the topic or field. This is where more broad concepts as well as broad questions are introduced, thereby having a wide scope. Then this is followed typically by more specific background that is necessary to understand the paper. it is where more specific concepts and questions are also commonly introduced, and therefore having a more narrow scope. Then this is followed by actions needed and taken to address these questions, and also their outcome. Then the discussion and conclusion section, there should be the answer to the specific question and evidence supporting these interpretations of the results. Lastly, the paper should open up again to a broader scope to tell us how these findings impact our society and the way we think about things. Based on this structure, you can see that the top and bottom halves of this structure are linked in that the question you pose in the introduction should be answered in the discussion. And therefore, when one thinks about the storyline of a scientific paper, begin and end are actually connected. Although we now have a common understanding of what the basic structure of a paper looks like, it's difficult to visualize how this actually looks like with just simple concepts. So next, let's have a look at an example of a paper which contains good storytelling. I have selected one paper that was published at my former journal as a case study. The paper I have picked comes from a Japanese team led by Tatsushi Igaki from Kyoto University. I really enjoyed reading this paper, and although it may not be perfect, it certainly has many of the qualities of a good story. As we also have non-biologists in our audience today, I have provided a simple set of definitions for the terminology within the paper on the left-hand side to make it more accessible to everyone. So, if I am to summarize this paper in a relatively simple way, using fruit flies, or shoujobai in Japanese, this paper addresses the question, what is the mechanism by which hyperinsulinemia, or the overproduction of insulin, that has been linked to metabolic diseases such as obesity and diabetes, how this leads to the formation of tumors, which are cells with the potential to become cancers. Therefore, you can all appreciate the importance of answering such a question. And what they actually find is they identify a factor that is needed for tumor-removing cell competition, or saibokyogo in Japanese, which is a mechanism to remove abnormal cells. The loss of this factor results in the overproduction of insulin. This increased levels of insulin prevents tumor-removing cell competition from occurring. Lastly, they find changing the diet of flies as well as giving human anti-diabetic drugs can alter the growth of these tumors. Hence, together, this data was able to show that hyperinsulinemia promotes tumor growth by avoiding cell competition. I hope you can all appreciate the broad impact of these findings on society, especially on how we potentially think about metabolic diseases and cancer. And also the way we think about fruit flies as a model to study such processes. So now let's take a closer look at the actual paper. Let's now look more closely at each section within the paper, namely the introduction, the results, and discussion. For each section, I'll be mentioning 2 points that impact the way one tells their story in a paper. Let's start with the introduction first. Let's start from the very beginning. I have outlined in red the introduction section of the paper, and it is also shaded in red the first paragraph of the introduction, which I have enlarged below. The function of an introduction is to introduce briefly the known, which includes context and background, the unknown, and the problem. Looking at our case study, first and foremost, the central question is the most important part of the text. By identifying a question that is of broad interest, which is neither field or system specific, you'll be able to capture the interest of a wider audience outside of this field of research, as is the case with our example. But what is actually equally as important is how the story is built up to introduce the central question. In this paper, first, it grabs the interest of a broad audience by introducing concepts that are widely known and affect society, such as metabolic disease and cancer, as well as mentioning that there are links between these two diseases that affect our society. In doing so at the very beginning, it has tremendous impact and engages the interest of the reader or editor. Then, by elegantly linking fruit flies as a useful organism to understand some of the mechanisms linking metabolic diseases and cancer, the authors highlight the utility of using such an organism to study the processes this paper is concerned with. And there you have it. Already, just from the first paragraph, the reader knows immediately what this paper is about and what to expect from this paper. So, when you're writing your introduction, keep in mind not only the central question to engage the interest of the audience, but also how you lead into the question that will impact whether a reader will continue to read your paper or not. Next, let's look at how the introduction ends. I have outlined again in red the introduction and shaded in red the end of the introduction, which is enlarged below. The end of an introduction can be significantly different from author to author. Some authors provide a full summary, while others write close to nothing and may even end their introduction with a question. My opinion is that the end of the introduction should provide a hint or a taste of what is to be expected from your paper and their potential implications. Let's have a closer look at our case study. As you can see, what they provide is an overview of their results without going into too much details, and then discussing the potential broader implications of the study, especially in the field of cancer biology. Because the summary of the results is not sufficient to actually understand what is actually in the paper, but it does give an indication of what is to be expected, this not only increases the curiosity of the reader with the suspense of wanting to know what they actually have as data, but due to the potential implications of the study, it heightens the anticipation of the reader, which is a great way to transition to the results section that we'll be discussing next. Now let's look at the results section. On the left-hand side is displayed 4 pages of text from the results section of the paper. The results section serves the function to describe your findings, while many may think that the results actually consist of a series of simple data. It actually has a structure in itself. Looking at our example, I have enlarged the section outlined in red for the purposes of our discussion. You can see that the results have been designed to be accessible and reader-friendly by using active subheadings that allows a reader to immediately parse out essential information from your results. Furthermore, by adding a summary sentence in the end of each subsection, you reinforce the message. Then, by effectively linking the beginning of each section of your results through linker sentences. That typically answers questions like what, how, or why. This helps a reader to understand more easily the logical basis of what type of experiments you will be doing next and the results one can anticipate. By using such a structure within your results, you improve the flow within the text by making it more reader-friendly and easy to follow. And this makes your paper more accessible and will not only allow the reader or an editor to understand the contents of your paper better, but it will also allow editors to tell your story better to their editorial team. Therefore, remember to use active subheadings and linking your subsections to describe your findings when you're writing your results. This flow also has another advantage, as it helps make it easier to logically link sequences of your data in order to answer your central question. Going back to the introduction, the central question is, what is the mechanism by which overproduction of insulin leads to tumor growth and cancer? And looking at the answer in the discussion section is the overproduction of insulin that leads to tumor growth by avoiding cell competition. If we now look at the overall layout of the results section, listing only the active subheadings of each subsection, it would look something like this. For the purposes of simplicity, if we just describe the essence of what each subsection or group of subsections are showing, it would look something like this, where the paper identifies first what factors regulate the mechanism of tumor growth, then where this factor is functioning, and how this factor and mechanism is functioning, which in terms of data is the climax of the story, showing that the overproduction of insulin leads to tumor formation by avoiding cell competition. And lastly, it ends with data that has more social and clinical implications by showing how diet or the use of an anti-diabetic drug is able to alter tumor growth. Through such logical transitioning within the results, you can see how the flow of results leads to a satisfying answer. Next, let's take a look at the discussion section. The primary function of the discussion is to answer your central question and not to re-summarize your results, which is a common mistake made by many authors. If we go to our case study, going back to the first paragraph of the introduction where there's the central question, and now to the first part of the discussion, which is shaded in red and enlarged below, you can see in response to the question, how does hyperinsulinemia promote tumor growth? The authors provide the answer, which fully satisfies this question by stating essentially that hyperinsulinemia promotes tumor growth by avoiding cell competition. And by doing so, you can now see how the top half and bottom half of the hourglass are linked. Furthermore, as authors are able to completely answer their central question, in fact, the paper forms a loop as the question has been 100% satisfied, which should be the goal of every paper. I would really like to stress this point with regards to answering your central question, because this is one of the most common reasons papers are rejected, where an author raises an interesting question but does not end up answering their question. So make sure that your answer actually answers your question totally. Another thing you may have noticed in the discussion section is that in the beginning, it begins with the answer, and it ends with the broader implications and the impact on our society, such as by describing the potential therapeutic implications of these findings against cancer. And the text in between these two parts flows to provide supporting evidence from the literature and also links back to the author's own results. Therefore, this directionality there is a kind of a directionality here, going from the strong evidence to the weak, or from fact to speculation. This is also how I would like to suggest that authors construct their discussion, as immediately after the results section is actually the most effective point with the most impact in the discussion. So don't waste the discussion section of your paper with a summary, but rather answer your question first and then discuss the broader implications and speculations of your study. To this point, one can see how a nice story is structured and also the essential elements each section contains. And from this, one can see how to construct a paper that is logical and more easy to understand. But how does each of these sections influence the paper and the story as a whole? In the last part of this section of my talk, let's look at how this impacts a reader. If we line up each of the sections within the paper and assess the effects each section has on the reader, we can see that by first introducing a topic and a question of broad interest, this engages the audience early on in the paper and raises their curiosity and interest, making the readers intrigued by the potential contents of the paper. This style of writing is common in papers published in Nature and Science, in order to grab the attention of the reader or editor immediately. This effect is further enhanced at the end of the introduction by providing a brief description of the findings and their potential impact, without going into too many details. By doing so, it heightens the anticipation and interest of a reader for the actual contents of the paper and their findings. But the only way to do this is actually to read the paper further, which is of course exactly what you want. Next, by constructing your results in such a way that it is logical and easy to follow, you steer the readers towards the climax of your paper. And lastly, by answering your central question, the reader then obtains satisfaction and also deeper appreciation upon understanding the social impact of the study. By incorporating such dynamics into a scientific story, a paper becomes not only more exciting to read, but also more satisfying to read. And this should be one of the main goals you should be trying to achieve with your storytelling. With this, I would like to go to the last part of my talk, which is consisting of more practical advice on how to construct your story. Firstly, some of you may have noticed that I have not mentioned the abstract of a paper. I did this intentionally because the abstract follows slightly a different organization to the classical hourglass structure. Let me explain what I mean by this. Firstly, it is important to understand the actual function of an abstract. It can be said that while the appealingness of a story will be dependent on the central question you ask and the answer you get, the first impression of your paper is dependent on the abstract. It is like the face of your paper. A common mistake done by many authors is to literally summarize their paper in the abstract. but instead, you should think of it as a mini story. Let's have a look at our case study. You will immediately notice one unique feature, which is that it is constructed to engage the reader immediately by introducing a general point of broad interest and giving the answer to the study. And only after that does it go back to the hourglass structure of the story, giving the background, summary of results, and the broader implications of the study. If you remember about how a good story steers the emotions and the interest of a reader, it achieves this by immediately stating the points that have the highest impact in the study. This type of writing is particularly effective in the abstract and is often used by journalists and newspapers, and is also seen in papers published in Nature and Science, where the editor has very little time and the authors need to grab their attention. So make a strong impact immediately in the abstract so you can grab the attention of an editor. Next, I more about how to think about writing your paper. How can an author design a more successful scientific story? For that, I would like to propose the 3 S's. Keep it simple, solid, and surprising. So why these 3 S's? Simple, as a simple message, is the most effective and most memorable one. Solid, because reproducible results are the most convincing ones. And surprising, because you should never underestimate the impact surprising or unexpected results have on a reader and how this helps them become more interested in the story. Therefore, keeping in mind the 3 S's when you write your paper next time will help you write your story in a more clear and captivating as well as memorable way. Now, as for how to actually construct your story, have a think about this. While science is typically hypothesis-driven, paper writing actually is not always so, as paper writing is a retrospective process, which means that it is constructed after you acquire most or all of your data. This actually means that it does not necessarily need to follow the original logic of your paper. So all you need to do is follow the logic that makes the most sense to you. Furthermore, unlike a conventional story, where the author must write the material to build up to the climax, you already know the climax of your story, so use this to your advantage. It begins with identifying what is your key or unexpected finding in your paper. Then, determining how this finding has the broadest potential impact to the field or society. And then to build your story around this point. After that, you can establish your unique central question in the paper. All that then remains is to fill in the necessary gaps of information to be able to understand your work sufficiently. Now, some of you may be asking, how can I find the most interesting part of my story? For those people, I would suggest potentially one of 2 strategies. If you have ever read a paper published in Cell Press, you will notice that they all contain a section which consists of 4 highlights and a brief summary. This is typically done at the very end after a paper has been accepted. But my suggestion is, why not do this in the very beginning? To identify only 4 key points in your paper. And from these points, find one that is the most important and build your story around that. Alternatively, simply write a brief version of your paper, such as on one page of A4. By succinctly summarizing your paper, you will find the essence of your paper, which will make it easier to expand on. And if that also doesn't work, just as a more general tip, why don't you ask a colleague or a friend that you trust for their opinion on what they find is interesting about your paper? Getting input from others is always helpful, and it might give you the kind of clarity that will be useful for writing your paper. And with that, I would like to come to an end with my presentation. I hope I have convinced you the values of storytelling and also provided some techniques and strategies that you can find useful for the next time you're writing your paper. And with that, I would like to go to my acknowledgements. I would like to thank all the members of the Ashby Research Acceleration Unit for their input on the contents of today's presentation and daily working environments. I would also like to thank Hiromi Sumita from Line for her input, as well as Komori-san and Sano-san for their immense effort to disseminate and promote the seminar. And I would like to also give a special thanks to Tatsushi Igaki for giving me permission to use his paper as a case study for this talk. And I would like to thank you, of course, for your attention. And these are some of my affiliations and personal liaising. I'm also personally liaising with the Stellar Science Foundation. And before we move to the Q&A, as a brief note of an upcoming seminar from our unit, my colleague Makoto Shida will be giving a writing seminar on Kakenhi grant writing on August 5th from 4 p.m., which you can register, where you can register from this link or QR code. So keep an eye out for that. Now, let's move to the Q&A.
Thank you, Spiros. Let me just share my slides. Okay, thank you so much, Spiros, and also to the participants, which we see that we have over 1,200 participants online right now. And we would like to go into the Q&A session with the questions we have received so far. So let's begin. First question. In interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research, it is sometimes more difficult to construct a convincing story since the audiences may include more broader audiences in various fields compared to a specific field, like your example in the presentation. How we can shape the story in multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary research so we can present a convincing research to the editor?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is quite a challenging question, I must say. Of course, without actually having directly the contents to look and compare what actual research fields you are using as a multidisciplinary research topic for your paper, it can be quite challenging. I would say that in that case, it's a question, of course, also of which multidisciplinary field is the most attractive one, because that will be probably the centerpiece of the manuscript. But of course, without actually having an example in front of me, it's a little bit difficult to actually define how to structure your paper in order to make it more appealing. However, I would say that as a general rule of thumb, you should not bring weak data as the main focus of your paper, of course, as even if it's an appealing topic, if it's weak data, even if it gets past the editors, it will get destroyed by the reviewers. And so always keep a solid story. And so I'm sorry, I can't offer a better answer in this particular situation. But yes, I appreciate that this can be a very difficult issue to combine these multidisciplinary topics in one paper.
Okay, thank you, Spiros. Next question. Which Asian countries has higher rate of rejection without peer review? Is it also the case for Japan?
Well, I mean, this is a little bit complicated, I would say, because there's rather some confidential data. Of course, having worked in a journal such as Developmental Cell and in Cell Press, it is confidential information. But of course, I would say that when you think about countries that submit the most papers, that sort of is a reflection perhaps of papers that might have been having a higher rejection rate. So I cannot offer a more direct answer, unfortunately, on this topic. However, Japan is one of the highest submitting countries in the world, and therefore it is on the higher end in terms of rejection rates, yes.
Okay, thanks. So I hope that answered the question. And the third question. I want to know some points to make the central question to construct ideal introduction.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is going back to the point that I mentioned in my presentation, which is that, of course, if you have a central question to build on, this is perhaps ideal. However, you have to keep in mind that when you're already thinking about constructing your paper, it means that you already have 60, 70, perhaps more % of your data, which means that what you should be basing your central question on is really the key data and how that has the most broadest impact in society. Because the broader implications has basically a larger crowd or audience that would be interested in hearing that story. So I would say that rather than identifying a central question, which on occasion you might not even be able to choose, because if you are a PhD student or a master degree student, you may not even get the opportunity to choose a question. This is a little bit challenging. However, I would try to take a more retrospective approach if you already have all of your data sets. And if it is the case that it is the start of a project, I would say that you should look at the literature and see what kind of places the papers that you are thinking of trying to publish are actually being published in. So if those are not going into the high tier journals, that suggests that maybe it's not a very hot topic that will be very popular among journals. So take that into account.
Okay, thanks. Okay, let's go to the next question. How to know the name of the editor, associate editor, who might take care of my paper? There are many editors, associate editors in a journal.
Mm-hmm. So this depends on what part of the process your paper actually is in. So, for example, in Cell Press, typically there is sort of email that is automated, that gets sent to the authors when a paper gets sent out for peer review, that so-and-so is handling your paper, essentially. And if it's not the case that, if it's the case that it's the initial submission, then it's done more blindly. And actually it's irrelevant, really, who the editor actually is, because if it's a rejection, you'll hear from whom it is from. So they would write their name in their rejection letter. And of course, if it's sent out for peer review, you should probably know the identity of the person that is handling your paper. But I would say that identifying a name at the initial submission doesn't really impact much the process itself, because there is another element which I haven't discussed today, which is called the cover letter of a manuscript, where many people direct it to a specific name or a person, but it's not always guaranteed that that person will be handling that paper. So it's done on a blind case typically, and the other aspect is there could be conflicts of interest as well. So if I have a good relationship with an author, I would not be taking that paper, essentially because I would have a conflict of interest of actually handling that paper, because it would make it really awkward for me to actually deal with it. So in those cases, even if you picked my name as an editor, I would not be handling it, and one of my colleagues would be handling it. So it would sort of be in that kind of way.
Okay, so the next one, how do we effectively incorporate literature review in OutStory, especially when we want to emphasize our topic, which has not been addressed by the literature yet?
Mm-hmm. So it depends, I guess, on which section of the paper you're thinking about. And I think the obvious one would be, of course, the introduction, where you would want to incorporate literature. However, I would tend to err on the side of caution in terms of the amount of literature any person cites in their introduction. So if there's not much literature that actually exists, this is almost like a gold mine in many ways, because effectively there's so many unknown factors that exist that basically you can organize basically the paper in a way or fashion which makes it the most appealing. Whereas papers that are in fields that are very saturated, so there's lots of papers that already exist in that field, basically no one really wants to see a review of the literature in an introduction, because that also suggests that there's very little that is left that is unknown, which makes it less appealing for an editor to consider the paper. So I would say that if it's the case that there's not much literature that is present, that works really good for you. If there's a lot of literature, I would be very selective about, of course, you have to be correct about what you're citing. So if there is precedent for things that have been found in your paper, you have to cite this. And if you don't cite this, and it goes out for peer review, for example, and then the reviewers comment on this, this tends to have a very, very negative impression on the editor, and also it has typically a negative impact on your paper, because basically you concealed, you hid that information. And then on top of that, it typically means that the paper is not very novel. So those things are hard things to overturn once reviewers say that there is no novelty in a work.
Okay, so the next question, how important the cover letter is? It frequently ends up with overlapping abstract. Does it require any additional information?
So I would say that if it's overlapping with your abstract, you're not writing it correctly, actually. The function of a cover letter is not to re-summarize a summary of your paper. The function of a cover letter is to appeal to the editor to say what is the most interesting thing about your paper, which means it should not be, you're wasting space if you are reciting basically the abstract of your paper, because all editors will be reading the abstract anyways. It's one of the first things an editor will be doing. And so if this is overlapping in terms of the contents, what is in the cover letter, and abstract, you're not using it effectively. Because this is a place where, firstly, no reviewers are able to see the contents of a cover letter. And it is actually a place where you have the best opportunity to convince an editor that your paper is interesting. So I would say that if that's the case, it should not be overlapping, and you should find the most interesting aspects, let's say social implications or broader context, where your findings are relevant and describing this, and for example, why your paper is so interesting. These are elements that should be included in a cover letter.
Okay, thanks. Now the time is running out, so maybe it's the last question, I guess. I know we have more than 40, so we'll think of a way. Okay, so the last question. Is the brief description of results and implications different from the study aim? In my field, it is common to describe a study aim at the end of the introduction session.
Perhaps it's not different. I would say that it's a question of, well, how you perceive the introduction and its function. It is not necessarily the case that you must, for example, give a brief description of results and implications. I would say that either way, at least over half of the papers that I looked at typically include some form of information of results and implications. However, it depends on how much is actually there. So I would observe that some people really recite their paper in their introduction, which is not the function of the introduction either. It's sort of to give a flavor of what one can expect. And so it's rather a succinct summary of your findings. And the study aim, I think, is slightly different because this is more geared similar to the actual central question, because it's like the opposite side of the coin almost, but just that basically it's not formed as a question, but rather as a point that you would like to investigate, which one can say, why is it interesting to investigate that question or that point? And I think that is much more of a fundamental component than, for example, the brief description in this case, for example.
Okay, thank you so much. And unfortunately, we don't have any time left. So let me just, okay. So we apologize for not being able to answer all the questions. I know we have over 40. And thank you so much for attending today's seminar. I hope that the talk was helpful. And there are 3 short announcements before we close today's seminar. First, please provide your feedback of the today. There will be a link on the questionnaire when you close the Zoom. Second, we will have today's slides uploaded at the ASHP website. We will inform you the link later by email. And last, we will have our next seminar on Kakehi granting on Friday, August 5th. There will be a registration link at the bottom of the questionnaire, so you can register when you provide us the feedback. So once again, thank you so much for joining today's seminar. Thank you, and see you again soon. Okay, so thank you.